1970s in Britain is a period of time that's associated with high inflation and industrial unrest. And this is epitomised in the imagination of British people by the Winter of Discontent, which was a period of industrial unrest towards the end of the 1970s, in the winter of 1978 into 1979, which brings down the Labour government of James Callaghan and ushers in 18 years of Conservative rule, led first by Margaret Thatcher and then by John Major, during which the balance of power between workers and capital is fundamentally shifted away from workers, represented of course by the trade unions, and towards business. So this is a really important tipping point in British history, and that's why I wanted to explore the Winter of Discontent today. And just to give you an idea of what has shaped popular perceptions of this period, I want to start by showing you a clip from the Conservative Party 1983 election broadcast.
Less than 5 years ago, we in Britain no longer believed we still had any right to think of ourselves as a world leader. But that has changed because of one woman who believed that our country, our people, could do more than we'd dreamed possible for many, many years, and much more than we thought possible in 1979. Do you remember what it was like then, in the Winter of Discontent, when Britain had come almost to a standstill as strike followed strike? Abroad, they joked about the British disease, but here it was not amusing. Everybody knew that it couldn't go on like this. Margaret Thatcher promised that it needn't, that Britain could change for the better. But could it? Let's see.
So hopefully what you can see there is that the strikes are presented in purely negative terms. The membership of the trade unions is seen as being run by union bosses, and the effect of the strike is always presented as negative for ordinary people trying to go about their lives. What isn't presented by this account, of course, is that inflation at this point in time, in 1978, was running upwards of 15%, and the whole reason why the Winter of Discontent kicked off is because the Labour government, under James Callaghan, was trying to keep wages at 5%. So it seems to me that the strikes were an inevitable consequence, really, of the policy pursued by the government, because what in essence the government was saying was that in order to maintain their prices and incomes policy, as it was known, in order to keep inflation below 5%, what they were expecting working people to do was to accept a real terms pay cut of upwards of 10%. Now, what working person would do that when the alternative is, of course, to bargain with the employer and, if necessary, take strike action? Now, the most important thing to say about the context of these strikes is that the 1970s were a period of very high inflation caused by what economists call exogenous shocks. Just like in today's world, we've experienced high inflation because of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Back in the 1970s, there were two big oil shocks. In 1973, there was the Yom Kippur War, and then there was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And these had the effect of restricting the oil supply and causing global prices to go up. And of course, this was felt in the UK in high levels of inflation, which meant that prices were going up and up and up. And of course, in that context, if prices in general are rising and your wages aren't keeping up, then that means that your standard of living is going to be decreasing. So of course, in a period of time like that, you're going to get heightened union activity, you're going to get heightened industrial unrest, and as a consequence, if wages do not rise, you're going to get strike action, just as night follows day. So that explains the background of these things. And I guess the other thing to say is that how the government responded to strike action back then was to engage in what was called a prices and incomes policy. And this is where the government, either voluntarily or through statutory provisions, tries to keep wage demands down and tries to keep price rises down, essentially by getting workers and by getting businesses together and by saying to them, look, you're going to have to agree to keep your price levels down and to keep your wages down through negotiation. And this had worked actually for Callaghan's government for around about 3 years. He'd managed through a prices and incomes policy to really keep control of wage demands by working with the trade unions. And of course it was a lot easier for him as a Labour Prime Minister to do this. But from the perspective of the workers themselves, with inflation running at 15% and having experienced around about a decade really of these prices and incomes policy and therefore wages being kept down, and 3 years under a Labour government, they'd reached breaking point. And it reached a point where the Labour Party was saying to workers, you need to keep your wage demands to 5%, and they just couldn't do that. So this really is why the strikes happen, because workers, starting with workers at the Ford Motor Company, realise that they can get far more by using their industrial muscle than by sticking to an arbitrary pay policy implemented by the Labour government. So the net result of the strike is that the union settled for pay increases of between 15 and 20%. Now these sound like very high numbers, but we need to appreciate that these numbers should be taken in the context of very high levels of inflation. So in real terms, what workers were actually achieving by going on strike is to either maintain their level of pay at 0% in real terms, or a modest 5% increase in wages, and that 5% increase, or a 20% pay rise in nominal terms, was only achieved by lorry drivers who'd gone on strike and had effectively brought the transport network that was responsible for bringing food to towns and cities to a standstill. So really, you were only getting inflation-busting pay rises in circumstances where you had a really strategic importance to the country. Now, more broadly, the implications of this strike was that it weakened the government of James Callaghan. And this was particularly the case because James Callaghan went off during the strike to a conference of world leaders in the Caribbean, and he stayed on for a holiday briefly in Barbados. And coming off the plane, he gave a press conference and seemed to make light of what was going on in the country. Let's just hear a little bit of that now to get a sense of how much Callaghan misjudged the mood of the country at that point in time.
Prime Minister, have you a reaction to the criticism that you shouldn't have been away from the country during these past 4 or 5 days?
I'm sure everybody would have liked to have been with me, but I don't think anybody except a few journalists are very jealous of it. I think that they feel that we've been working hard, as indeed we have. And you know, I actually swam, and I know that's the most exciting thing of the visit. But no, I think you should put all that kind of criticism in perspective, and one mustn't allow jealousy to dissuade you from doing what you know is the best thing.
What is your general approach and view of the mounting chaos in the country at the moment?
Well, that's a judgment that you are making. I promise you that if you look at it from outside, and perhaps you're taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos. You know, we've had strikes before, we've come close to the brink before. There's need for a great deal of industrial self-discipline in this country. I hope we shall gradually learn it, and that we shall avoid hurting each other. But please don't run down your country by talking about mounting chaos.
Does the government's pay policy stand firm, Prime Minister?
I don't think I want to discuss pay policy just at this moment, but you can take it that I have not wavered one iota from my views about what is the best way for this country to proceed in order to keep employment up and in order to make sure that inflation doesn't rise. And whatever happens on the industrial front can't change that view. That stands, and we shall have to continue to follow it up. Now, don't you think that's sufficient after an 11, 9-hour flight overnight?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And no breakfast? However, with the mounting chaos that he talks about in the country, I doubt if I should even find a cup of coffee, do you?
Now, as with many things in Britain, the effect of this crisis was mediated by the right-wing press, and the Sun newspaper leapt upon Callaghan's press conference, and it used the phrase, crisis, what crisis? In other words, what they were trying to say was that Callaghan coming off the plane, coming off essentially what they were saying was a holiday in Barbados, even though he'd originally gone there for a conference, that Callaghan was making light of the concerns of the British public. And this phrase, crisis what crisis, was expertly used by the Conservative Party during their election campaign in 1979. Let's just take a quick look at that.
Crisis? What crisis? 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 Crisis? What crisis?
So there we go. The end result, of course, is that Margaret Thatcher goes on to win that election in 1979, and as I've said, that results in a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the trade unions and business, which we're still living with today, and with consequences that affect all of us. The reason why it's harder for us to negotiate for better terms and conditions and for better wages, and the reason why we've lived really through a cost of living crisis and struggled really to fight back, is partly because of the decline in trade union power that we've seen since 1979, which I would trace back ultimately to the Winter of Discontent and the way it was conceptualised and the way it was sort of embedded within the political imagination in Britain as this period of crisis and this period where really the trade union movement was discredited by the press and by right-wing interest within our society. Well, anyway, that's all for now. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And for now, goodbye and best wishes.